Diseases and bugs named after places. Hello and welcome to the channel. In my video on Lyme disease, I promised to give the scoop on diseases named after geographic locations, after the example in that video of Lyme disease itself, Lyme being a town in Connecticut, USA. I go on in that video to describe some other examples, such as Factor V Leiden, the clotting disorder named after a town in Holland, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, and Coxsackie virus, which is implicated in many illnesses, including hand, foot, and mouth disease, meningitis, and diabetes. The naming of illnesses, diseases, viruses, and syndromes after geographical locations is a long-established tradition in medicine and biology. These names often reflect the place where the disease was first identified, where it emerged in an outbreak, or where it was extensively studied. This practice, however, has sparked controversy over the years due to the potential for stigmatization and geopolitical tensions that arise from associating a place with a harmful condition. For instance, the identification of diseases during colonial times often reflected the locations where European explorers and settlers first encountered illnesses that were foreign to them. The practice persisted into the 20th century as global travel and trade expanded, allowing previously localized diseases to spread worldwide. Place-based naming also served a practical purpose. Before the advent of modern diagnostic tools and global medical databases, health officials and researchers often referred to a disease by the name of the place where it was first discovered, or where it caused a notable outbreak. These names facilitated communication between health professionals across regions and countries. However, the growing global consciousness about the stigma and unintended consequences of naming diseases after places has led to debates about the ethics of this practice. Several organizations, including the World Health Organization, have since revised their guidelines for disease naming to avoid place-based monikers, opting instead for more neutral and descriptive names. So, let's dive into the possibilities that we are already conscious of, and later on in the video we can talk about current issues that have spiked an outrage amongst certain populations due to the stigmatization of their country, of their town, of their local area. So here goes. Number 1, the Spanish flu of 1918. The Spanish flu is perhaps one of the most famous examples of a disease named after a country. The 1918 influenza pandemic infected 1/3 of the global population and killed tens of millions of people. Despite its name, the Spanish flu did not originate in Spain. The reason for the association lies in Spain's neutral position during World War I. While many countries involved in the war suppressed information about the pandemic to maintain morale, Spain's press openly reported on the severity of the outbreak, leading to the mistaken belief that the flu originated there. What a case of mistaken identity in medicine. This happens a lot more than we know about. Number 2, Zika virus or Zika virus. The Zika virus is named after the Zika forest in Uganda, where it was first identified in rhesus monkeys in 1947. Although the virus remained relatively obscure for decades, it gained international attention during a significant outbreak in 2015 to 2016, particularly in Brazil. The Zika virus is primarily transmitted through mosquito bites and has been linked to birth defects, most notably microcephaly, a small brain. The virus's geographic name served as a reference to its origins, but its rapid spread across the Americas also made it a global health concern. Number 3, Ebola virus. The Ebola virus is named after the Ebola River in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, formerly known as Zaire, where the first known outbreak occurred in 1976. The virus caused severe hemorrhagic fever and has a high mortality rate. The name Ebola quickly became synonymous with fear due to the lethality of the virus and the devastation caused by several major outbreaks, particularly the West African Ebola outbreak of 2014 to 2016. The association of the virus with a specific place, however, has raised concerns about the stigmatization of the region. Number 4, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, MERS. Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, is a viral respiratory illness caused by a coronavirus. So, our recent COVID outbreak was not the first outbreak caused by a coronavirus. I think it was actually coronavirus 2, our recent COVID. The original coronavirus happened in the Middle East, specifically in Saudi Arabia in 2012. The name MERS reflects its association with the region. MERS is characterized by fever, cough, and shortness of breath, and it has a high mortality rate, particularly in older individuals and those with underlying health conditions. While the name provides a geographical reference to the initial outbreaks, it also has the potential to stigmatize the entire Middle East region, as was seen with other place-named diseases. Guinea worm disease is number 5 on my list. Guinea worm disease, or dracunculiasis, is a parasitic infection caused by the nematode Dracunculus medinensis. The name guinea worm likely refers to the Guinea region of West Africa, where the disease was endemic. The condition is spread through drinking contaminated water and causes excruciating pain as the adult worm enters into the skin, or rather, when it emerges from the skin having previously entered. Though the disease has been eradicated in many regions due to public health efforts, it remains an example of how place-based disease names can evoke strong associations with specific geographic locations. West Nile virus is number 6. West Nile virus was first identified in Uganda's West Nile district in 1937, giving rise to its name. The virus, transmitted by mosquitoes, can cause severe neurological disease in humans, including encephalitis, infection or inflammation of the brain, and meningitis, infection or inflammation of the brain lining, although most infections are asymptomatic. Since its discovery, the virus has spread to numerous parts of the world, including North America, where it caused outbreaks in the early 2000s. The name continues to serve as a reminder of the virus's African origins, though its reach is now global. Number 7 is Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever. Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever, RMSF, is a bacterial infection caused by Rickettsia rickettsii, transmitted through tick bites. Despite its name, the disease is not confined to the Rocky Mountain region of the United States, but the name originated due to its early cases being identified in that area of the United States. RMSF causes fever, headache, and a distinctive rash, and can be fatal if not treated promptly. The name has remained in use due to its historical significance, even though the disease occurs in other parts of the country. The next syndromes I describe are all psychological syndromes described by Ernest Lawrence Abel in September 2014. The first one on my list here is Jerusalem syndrome, which is the best known of all the tourist city syndromes. Jerusalem syndrome is a psychological breakdown that happens to some men and women shortly after arriving in Jerusalem. What distinguishes this syndrome from other city syndromes is its religious focus. Symptoms include delusions like believing one is Jesus, John the Baptist, Mary, Moses, or some other religious figure. People who develop these delusions often go about the streets shouting biblical verses, claiming redemption is imminent, delivering sermons to that effect, and/or obsessing about bodily purification to the point that they shave all bodily hair, perform repetitive ritual bathing, and compulsively cut their finger and toenails. The first cases of Jerusalem syndrome were described and named in the 1930s by Israeli psychiatrist Heinz Hermann, but it was not until late 1970s that psychiatrists began tracking and keeping detailed clinical records of cases. There may be comparable reactions among visitors to the Vatican, Mecca, Lourdes, or other spiritual centers, but there are as yet no comparable reports from these cities. Paris syndrome is a pattern of physical and psychological symptoms that mainly affects first-time Japanese visitors to the City of Light. About 12 Japanese tourists, most of them men and women in their 30s, come down with the syndrome each year. Symptoms include anxiety, delusions like believing their hotel room has been bugged, or that they are France's long-dead Sun King, Louis XIV, and hallucinations. The syndrome was first reported in 2004 in the French psychiatric journal Nervure. Japanese tourists are believed to be especially affected because of travel exhaustion, the unsettling contrast between the everyday informality of French city life, such as street vendors shouting at them in a language they do not understand, contrasted with the idealized image of the city based on movies and commercials as friendly, quaint, and affluent. The Japanese embassy maintains a 24-hour hotline for tourists who come down with the syndrome and helps them find medical treatment. Most of those affected improve after a few days of bed rest, but some are so traumatized the only cure is to be flown immediately back to their home country under a doctor's care. This is not a fabrication. This is actually true. Now, Japanese tourists are known for their absolute commitment to enjoying every single sightseeing site there is to be seen on their trip. And they're quite famous, right? You can see Japanese tourists everywhere, from the mountains of Switzerland, in the highest Alps in Switzerland, to the remotest areas in South America. They really are a tourist nation. Next, we come to Florence syndrome. Now, this is also known as Stendhal syndrome, after Dr. Stendhal, who first described it, or who had a connection with it. This is an acute behavioral reaction triggered by the anticipation and then the actual experience of Florence's cultural richness. Milder symptoms include a rapid heart rate, dizziness, fainting, and hallucinations. About 2/3 of those affected develop paranoid psychosis, which is a serious psychological illness akin to schizophrenia. The syndrome was first clinically reported by Florentine psychiatrist Dr. Graziella Magherini in the 1980s. Magherini has since detailed more than 100 instances of tourists taken to the emergency room at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital in Florence, directly from the city's art galleries or museums. Most cases are Western European tourists, 20 to 40 years of age. American tourists do seem as vulnerable, and no instances of the syndrome have been found in people who actually live in Florence. Treatment is bed rest. Most of those affected are able to go home after a few days. Venice syndrome is the decision made by people intent on suicide to unalive themselves in Venice, which for them, according to Italian researchers, is the symbol of death. Between 1988 and 1995, 51 foreigners, both men and women, tried to unalive themselves in Venice. Did you ever hear of this? I didn't either, until now. Most of them were from Germany, possibly influenced by Thomas Mann's Death in Venice book. But they also came from England, France, the US, and elsewhere. 16 sadly succeeded. The 35 who were saved told researchers they had traveled specifically to Venice to unalive themselves. Most of the women took drug overdoses. Most of the men hurled themselves from hotel windows, jumped from bridges, or tried to drown themselves in the putrid lagoon. Lead researcher Diana Steiner told reporters that the main reason these people had come to Venice was that in the collective imagination of romantic people, the association of Venice with decline and decadence was a recurring symbol. Stockholm Syndrome. I am sure most of us have heard about Stockholm Syndrome. This syndrome refers to the paradoxically emotional feelings or sense of loyalty and cooperation. About 25% of people taken hostage, kidnapped, or abused develop towards their captors or abusers. The name comes from a bank robbery and hostage situation in the summer of 1973 in Stockholm, Sweden, in which 4 of the bank's employees were taken hostage for 6 days. During the ordeal, the hostages, 3 women and 1 man, were strapped in dynamite and locked in a vault, while the bank robbers negotiated their way out of the situation. After their rescue, the hostages hugged and kissed their captors. Publicly said they were more afraid of the police trying to rescue them than they were of the hostage takers, raised money for their captors' defense, and refused to testify against them at trial. One of the hostages became so attached to one of her captors, she later became engaged to him. The feelings that the hostages developed towards their captors was subsequently called Stockholm Syndrome by Swedish psychiatrist Dr. Niels Bejerot, who worked with police during the incident. Since Stockholm Syndrome was first described, it has been cited to explain why battered wives stay with their spouses, as well as why, in some cases, victims of kidnapping and abuse cooperate with their abusers. One of the better-known subsequent instances is the abduction of the 19-year-old Patty Hearst in 1974 by a guerrilla group, the Symbionese Liberation Army. Despite being you can imagine, right? The word here. It involves violence against a woman in a certain way. And beaten during her 17-month captivity, she identified with the group and even willingly took part in a bank robbery with them, a crime for which she spent 2 years in prison until she was subsequently pardoned by President Clinton. More recently, in 2003, teenage kidnap victim Elizabeth Smart was considered to have developed Stockholm Syndrome. After being rescued, police learned she had had several chances to escape, but traveled openly with her captors, who she told police were her parents. Fascinating, huh? How our brains can trick us into all kinds of associations and alliances, even in difficult and traumatic experiences, especially in traumatic and difficult experiences. Maybe it's a way that our minds protect us from trauma. It's a coping mechanism. Lima syndrome is the opposite of Stockholm syndrome in terms of its dynamics. Instead of the hostages developing positive feelings towards their captors, it is the captors who develop the positive emotional reactions and bond with their hostages. This eponymous syndrome, so meaning named after a specific place or person, takes its name from a hostage crisis in Lima, Peru, in December 1996. In that year, members of the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement, the MRTA, took more than 600 guests attending a party at the Japanese ambassador's residence in Peru hostage. Within a few days, the militants set most of the hostages free, including some that were very prominent, such as the mother of Peru's then president. After 4 months of unsuccessful negotiations, in April of the following year, all except one of the remaining hostages were freed after a raid by the Peruvian Special Forces, in which 2 of the MRTA and 1 of the commandos died. London syndrome is the opposite of both Stockholm and Lima syndromes. In this syndrome, one or more of the hostages provokes his or her death by arguing or annoying captors, physically challenging them, trying to escape, or debating political ideology if the captors are terrorists. Captors come to dislike such hostages so intensely they kill them at the first opportunity. London syndrome gets its name from a 1981 siege of the Iranian embassy in London, in which 26 hostages were taken captive. During the siege, one of the hostages repeatedly argued with the captors, even though other hostages urged him to keep quiet. You can imagine, right? Shut up. Do you want to get us killed or what? Keep your mouth shut, mate. You can imagine, huh? In a London accent. Several days into the siege, the captors decided to kill one of the hostages to force compliance with their other demands. They chose the argumentative hostage, shooting and then throwing his body out into the street. This prompted a special forces attack, during which several additional hostages were killed. Other instances of London syndrome have been subsequently noted, although not labeled as such when the events were first described. One is the stabbing to death of a hostage who ignored orders and repeatedly removed his blindfold during an airline hijacking. Another is the shooting of a guard taken hostage during a botched jewelry store holdup in Beverly Hills, California in 1986. Although tied and lying face down on the floor, the hostage was killed because the robber said he was talking back to me. Imagine getting killed because you talked back to someone. What a world, huh? What a world. Amsterdam syndrome. This is a term coined by the University of La Sapienza sexologist Chiara Simonelli and subsequently reported in the Italian newspaper La Stampa to describe a phenomenon resembling sexting. Only in this instance, it refers to the behavior of men who show pictures of their naked spouses or themselves having relations with their spouses, with or without their spouse's awareness or consent. It started out as a syndrome that was primarily found among Italian men filming their wives and or lovers naked and then posting them on the internet. The term comes from the red light district in Amsterdam, where prostitutes invitingly sit in the window area on display. I think the recent case in France, where a man went so far as to invite multiple men to abuse his wife in a specific way, you know the word I'm trying to say, is an extreme case of Amsterdam syndrome in our recent era. Brooklyn syndrome. This fancifully named syndrome was coined during World War II by Navy psychiatrists examining recruits who seemed to have a chip on their shoulders. Initially regarded as a psychopathology, it occurred so frequently that the physicians subsequently recognized it as a pattern of behavior characteristic of men from cities where men are seemingly overly argumentative or personally combative. Detroit syndrome refers to replacing older workers with younger, faster, and stronger employees with new knowledge and skills. This form of age discrimination uses the metaphor of Detroit as the motor city and the regular replacement of older car models by newer models for its symbolic meaning. While naming diseases after places was once a common and seemingly practical practice, it has sparked significant controversy in modern times. Critics argue that place-based disease names can contribute to stigma, discrimination, and economic harm for the people and regions associated with the illness. The most prominent example of this debate is the Down syndrome, which used to be known as Mongols disease, the implication being that sufferers of Down syndrome have the appearance of people from the country of Mongolia. After a backlash from Mongolia, the name was changed to Down syndrome after the English physician who first discovered it. Another famous example of this controversy occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic. The virus that causes COVID-19, initially referred to as the Wuhan virus or China virus by some, led to widespread backlash against these geographic names. Critics pointed out that using such terms fueled xenophobia, racism, and prejudice against people of Chinese and East Asian descent. Furthermore, the association of the virus with China led to political tensions and even physical attacks on individuals perceived to be of Chinese origin. In response to these issues, the World Health Organization issued guidelines in 2015 aimed at minimizing the negative impact of disease names. The guidelines recommend avoiding the use of geographic locations, people's names, species of animals or foods, and cultural or occupational references when naming diseases. Instead, neutral terms that describe the disease's clinical features or the pathogen responsible for it are preferred. Despite these efforts, debates about place-based diseases or disease names continue to surface. For example, some argue that names like Ebola and Zika are already so deeply entrenched in public consciousness that changing them would cause confusion. Others believe that renaming efforts are essential to prevent the long-term stigmatization of affected regions. The global health community has begun shifting toward more neutral and descriptive naming conventions to reduce the potential harm caused by place-based names. These changes is part of a broader movement to make public health practices more sensitive to social and ethical concerns. So here we're talking about the more humanization, shall I say, or the tenderization of medicine. That's a word I made up, by the way. To make medicine much more, how should I put this? Humane, much more considerate, to populations, to individual people, and to, of course, raise the profile of the profession. Medicine already has quite a bad name in the old days, where doctors had, let's just say, not such a friendly bedside manner. This is one way that we can improve relations between medicine and the clients of medicine, which is basically all of us, because we all have health issues, right? So I think it's a nice thing. It's a nice gesture and a nice effort by the World Health Organization to address this issue. That's my opinion anyway. What do you make of all of this information? Have you heard about some of these diseases with names pertaining to specific regions or locations? What do you think of the scandalous name Mongolism to describe Down syndrome, or the description of the COVID-19 virus as the China virus? Does this give credence to a previous video of mine making the claim that medicine is a racist and sexist institution? Or is that taking things a bit too far? Whatever your thoughts, I would love to hear them. Go on, ask a doc.